Hey folks, it's Christmas, and so I thought I would make a video not only about organized stalking, but also about the increasing propaganda against people who suffer, and also about Jesus, his word, and what's expected of those who follow his word. Um, I just wrote something out last night because I don't want to ramble on today, so I'm just going to read that. The Golden Rule. Treat others the way you would want to be treated. Don't do unto others what you would not want others to do unto you. This is what is expected of those who follow Christ. It's that simple. It really isn't complicated, but the human mind is complicated. People will lie to themselves in order to justify themselves, and as long as they do that, they can never follow the Word. Remember, Jesus was the Word made flesh. He is the Word, and his Word is him. They are the same. There's no separation. Those who love his word love him, even without realizing it. And those who hate his word hate him, even as they claim to love him. The Golden Rule. Treat others the way you would want to be treated. Everything else is based on that. Those who can't empathize with others will never be able to follow the only command Jesus gave. And those who abuse others in the name of Christ actually deny his word as they claim to follow it. They are wolves in sheep's clothing. Sadly, because of the harm they do and the suffering they cause, they turn many against him. And that is the work of Satan. Any self-professed Christian who would go along with organized stalking or any type of covert psychological warfare that is meant to destroy the targets on every level is working for Satan, not God. Anyone who enjoys hurting people and would rather see people suffer than have mercy on them and try to ease their suffering is of Satan, not God. Don't be deceived. All right. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, I wanted to talk about an issue that is becoming increasingly troublesome, that being the silencing of abuse victims. And here I'm not only talking about victims of organized stalking, but of all abuse, both physical and psychological. And it's not just coming from the far right either. Both sides do it, though they have different methods of silencing those who suffer. The most sadistic abusers bait and provoke the targets into a negative response, just so that they can condemn the targets for that response. They continue to wage their psychological warfare, whose sole purpose is to create stress, anxiety, dread, and even rage in the target. Then, when the target begins to experience these traits, which are also signs of trauma, the target is deemed mentally ill, potentially violent, or worse. He or she is told that his or her anxiety, get this, is causing other people stress. Yes, this is the new garbage theory that the pseudoscientists have come out with, telling victims of abuse that their anxiety causes other people anxiety. The message is loud and clear. Shut up and stop complaining. And don't even flinch, no matter what is happening to you. Of course, if you can't achieve this, the sick, depraved, sadists will try even harder. They'll take their attacks up 10 levels until they force you to react, at which point you are condemned for your reaction. There is no way out. And this is a message that society is just being fed more and more. They want people to just pretend everything is fine when it isn't. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't try to calm themselves when they're being provoked. Of course they should. They should try to not allow themselves to be provoked. They should walk away. They should do whatever they can if they can. But pretending everything is fine when it isn't is not the solution. That just leads to apathy, and apathy leads to the crime continuing, leads to a continuation of the crime. Unfortunately, the masses gravitate to these new ideas like flies to you-know-what. Then they start doing the work of the perpetrators without even knowing it. So, for example, someone who is being tormented day in and day out, and I'm not just talking about targets of gang stalking or organized stalking, I'm talking about anyone who's in a situation that warrants a good amount of stress, anxiety, fear, and anger. People are abused all the time, even in situations where the abuse is legal and therefore can't even be called abuse. That doesn't mean the victims won't react to it on a psychological level, even on an instinctive biological level. For example, if a child is physically abused by an elder for long enough, he or she will begin to flinch when that person so much as raises a hand. This is an instinctive response to abuse. It is not a negative aspect of the child's character. It is not irrational. It is not unreasonable, and the child should not be guilted for tensing up when his or her abuser is near. Okay, this doesn't show us, it's not a sign of his poor character or poor nature. It's a very warranted response. It's legitimate. Trying to convince someone that their very legitimate fear of harm is actually irrational, despite the very real possibility of harm, is both sadistic and amoral. Not just immoral, amoral. If there is a very real threat, then the person who that threat is directed at is neither irrational nor mentally ill for experiencing anxiety. Yet today, we have depraved psychopaths whose sole intent is to create as much trauma as possible in the targets, just so that they can condemn those targets for their response to abuse, which is, in many cases, a PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder type of response. Only now, they've added guilt to the mix and are attempting to literally guilt victims of abuse, be it physical, psychological, aka gaslighting, or both, into hiding their suffering when in public and pretending that everything is fine when it isn't, so that they don't upset the clearly weak people around them. I guess that's what we're supposed to believe, that everyone is so weak that they can't handle the truth. This serves a few purposes for the criminals who are trying to enslave humanity in a dystopian nightmare worse than Orwell's 1984. The real prison here is a mental one. It's a prison for the mind. First, victims of abuse, including extreme abuse, will be forced to exert every ounce of energy they have in order to refrain from showing signs of stress in public. Targets of organized stalking and any type of gaslighting, even gaslighting that isn't part of organized stalking, have already had to struggle to do this because they know that as soon as they react publicly to the provocations, the satanic perpetrator will report them. But now the psychopaths in control have added even more ways in which abuse victims are to be silenced. And again, I'm not saying that people should just react publicly and just let it out. No, we do have to try to control ourselves and walk away and try to get on with our lives somehow. We can't just start shouting at everybody in the streets. But there's a fine line here. We need balance, okay? We need to try to find some peace in this, try to balance ourselves out, not allow ourselves to be provoked all the time. But that doesn't mean just blocking everything out and pretending everything is fine and letting everything go and never speaking about it, okay? And it doesn't mean we're never going to feel anxious or afraid. And there's nothing wrong with us for feeling anxious or afraid. It's not just in our head or something about our poor nature. So silencing of abuse victims. This will, in the end, force victims of abuse to shut off on a psychological level, obviously. If they're forced into silence, in order to not even flinch, they're going to have to shut off somehow, okay? To block out the abuse and allow it to continue unchallenged, since speaking up against it creates more abuse, both from the actual abusers and from the masses who have now practically deemed anxiety a moral sin, as they have yet again latched onto another garbage bit of propaganda fed to them by those who control, well, everything. Not only can this forced suppression create real mental disorders, such as any one of the numerous dissociative disorders, it will also increase the suffering of the victims as they struggle to remain silent while in extreme pain, emotional and or physical, and must use up every bit of strength they have in order to refrain from so much as flinching in a situation where it is both normal and natural for humans, both men and women, to break down, screaming, and even act out violently in some cases. If you look at what's done to the targets, it is an attack on every level. It's psychological, it's emotional, it's physical. It's meant to break them down to the point where they go screaming mad. And yet they're expected to not even flinch, right? This forced silence increases their suffering. And that is exactly what the sadistic, psychopathic animals and human flesh want. And as always, they use the masses to achieve this. If God is truth, Satan is lies. How much sense does it make to first claim to desire an end to suffering, but then, in order to achieve that, supposedly, to silence those who suffer, instead of trying to put an end to whatever is causing their suffering? If there is a raging fire in someone's home, the best way to prevent more damage is to put out the fire. Now, someone can certainly ignore the flames, but their house will burn down and their suffering will be increased 100-fold. Ignoring problems does not make them go away, although again, we do need to block them out sometimes. We do need to shut them out sometimes, okay? We do need to be able to calm ourselves and walk away and not allow ourselves to be provoked. There's a time and place for everything. But it doesn't mean falling into apathy, pretending everything is fine, letting it happen, never speak about it, right? And never solving the problem. We need to stand up and stop this. So these psychopaths, they just want to silence people who suffer instead of doing something to try to stop whatever is causing the suffering. Okay, they do this. They want those who suffer to suffer in silence, never speaking about it, never flinching, never making a sound. And they then use this to claim that suffering has ended, or that there was none to begin with. When in fact there still is, and it's very real. And if they wanted to, they could end it by ending whatever is causing it. Their level of delusion and deceit is absolutely driven by their sadistic impulses. They don't really want an end to suffering. It's the complete opposite. This is what they do. This is why they do everything in their power, not only to maintain and promote whatever causes the maximum amount of suffering, but to then include more demands and even make laws that will increase the suffering even more. Just because someone can avoid screaming when they're in pain does not mean they're not in pain. Their silence does not make their pain cease to exist, should this even have to be said. Now, when they are being tortured psychologically, which is the whole purpose of psychological warfare, a psyop, this becomes even harder for the masses to accept, as they can't see a physical source causing the pain. They therefore would rather believe it doesn't exist. If they believe it doesn't exist, they don't have to take any action to try and help the target or to end the abuse. They don't have to do anything at all, nor will they feel any remorse if, by chance, they went along with the abuse, even unwittingly, that is causing the target so much distress. This is the real delusion. This is the real mental illness. The ability to block out whatever factors get in the way of their own peace of mind, and by doing this, their ability to maintaining their ability to self-justify at all costs. Especially if they somehow benefit from the actions or situation that is causing so much harm toward others. They don't want to stop because they enjoy what they're doing, or they enjoy the benefits of whatever the action is. Denying the harm in their actions allows them to continue without remorse, and forcing their victims into silence to pretend everything is fine when it isn't is the easiest way for them to deny the harm in their actions, out of sight, out of mind. This ability to self-deceive will always get in the way of their ability to follow the word. As a result, this forced silence of abuse victims will lead the masses to believe that everything is just fine, as all they see are smiling faces. They can't comprehend the suffering and trauma that certain people around them are going through, and also they don't care. This shutting off of the targets and blissful ignorance of the masses leads to the targets lying down and giving up, submitting to a life of torment, and it leads to the masses pretty much living with their heads shoved in the sand. You thought I was going to say something else, didn't you? It leads them to be completely oblivious to the sadistic torture of men, women, and children that is taking place all around them. The psychopaths running this world are trying to, in a sense, lobotomize society, to drive people to shut off and block out whatever negative stimuli is causing stress or anxiety, including abuse of themselves and others, so that the people numb themselves to everything and thus stop fighting against the evils of this world. And again, I'm not saying that people shouldn't try to calm themselves and distance themselves and remove themselves from a situation that's causing stress and anxiety. Of course they should. Of course we need some peace. Of course we can't just allow ourselves to be provoked into negative reactions. But what is happening is that these criminals are looking for people not just to try to calm themselves, but to completely detach themselves to such an extent that they no longer care. And if they don't care, they're not going to fight against it, obviously. Until they shut up and take it. They do this until they shut up and take it and accept as a normal part of life. Accept it as a normal part of life and also allow it to happen to others. So that's what they want. They want people to just shut off and learn to accept this as normal life, and to the point where they're not even bothered by it anymore. They eventually then stop standing up for human rights and against human rights abuses. Obviously, if they have to shut out anything that might cause them a little psychological, emotional, and or spiritual discomfort, they're not going to fight against it. And that's the point. Consider, anyone who has a conscience is going to feel distress on a psychological level when they see or hear of the suffering of others. They will also feel anger toward those causing the suffering. They experience this because they have a conscience, unlike the psychopaths who not only feel no remorse for the suffering they or others cause, but they actually enjoy it. In this twisted world, people who have a conscience, empathy, and thus attempt to show mercy are considered the bad ones, the mentally ill ones, the ones who must be silenced, while the sadistic psychopaths are hailed as superior human beings. It is only in a world such as this, where humanity's conscience is crushed out of existence, that the satanic world rulers can get away with their sadistic agenda. The sadistic monsters seek to create the maximum amount of anguish among the human population. In silencing the entire population, the targets of abuse as well as the masses who become bystanders and enablers will do just that. Now let me also say something about the so-called, life coaches, guru types, these spiritual new agers. And I'm not condemning them. I like a lot of them, but there are some who take things a little bit too far. I have a lot of respect for people who try to help others in any way possible, and whatever their method is, good for them, but some take things too far, right? Some are just right now allowing themselves to be used as tools for the sadistic elite who are ruling the world and want to silence the population. Okay, they just love to tell people that their anxiety is nothing but a mental condition. It's all in our head. That's what they tell us, that there's nothing really there, Guys and gals, stop repeating propaganda like a bunch of mindless parrots. How in the hell do you know what someone else's life is like? How do you know what they're going through? Are you going to tell a child who is afraid to go home after school because his dad beats him and his mom doesn't care that there is nothing to fear, that his anxiety is all in his head? Don't speak for everyone. When you make a video or something, you're doing that for the masses, the entire population. We're all part of that. But it seems like you're speaking to a very specific group, and that is, this high class privileged group of elites who don't have any real problems, who are literally crying over spilled milk, and that's not the majority of us. Some people have real problems. Not everyone lives a life so privileged that their only worry is whether or not they'll get all the way to work in the morning without spilling their morning latte on the perfectly finished interior of their shiny new electric Prius. Some people really do have real problems. Some people have been abused. Some are still being abused, physically, including sexually, emotionally, spiritually, and worse. Some men and women live day to day, unsure of whether or not they'll be able to feed their family or pay for medical care for their kids, especially here in America, right? One little slip and fall on the way to work, one little mistake, like losing a bus pass, can crush their family. Not everyone has the wiggle room to falter even a bit, let alone make a huge mistake, which is a shame because, as they say, to err is human. We all make mistakes. The problem is that while one little mistake might not cause much trouble in one person's life, that same mistake made by someone else might lead to complete destruction. Lose your bus pass, pay with dollar bills, and get another bus pass the next day. Unless you don't have cash, are too poor to afford another bus pass for the month, and you don't get paid anyway until next week. Huge difference. No one with any ability for logic or reason would claim that these two situations are the same, and that the person who didn't get so upset is clearly better able to manage his or her stress level than the person who became visibly upset. Again, why should this even have to be said? I guess common sense isn't very common after all. Some people live in daily fear of when the next kick to the gut will come. Some, who are targets of extreme gaslighting, have to consider every move they make, every word they speak, as everything they say and do is twisted against them and used to condemn them, to justify physical violence against them, or to justify taking something from them that they need. They have to overthink everything to avoid those damned either way situations that gaslighters like to put people in. Everything becomes stressful, and that's exactly what the abusers intend. As their victims begin to break down and show signs of stress, the abusers use that response to further degrade the character and nature of the victim. And then there are targets of cyber stalking and even worse, organized stalking. People whose lives are being sabotaged on a daily basis, but because the attacks are so covert, it's very hard to prove it. People who are hunted like prey. Instinct is to fight or to flee. In this case, the targets can't do either. Can you imagine how brutally difficult this is and how much restraint they need? At this point, if someone is being attacked, abused, defamed, and destroyed, their life absolutely sabotaged, it becomes almost criminal to continue repeating the lie that nothing is happening, that it's all in their head, and that their anxiety isn't warranted. This lie not only helps the criminal abusers, leading to a continuation of abuse, since certain deceivers have managed to convince enough people that it isn't even really happening, it also leads to more stress, anxiety, and absolute anguish for the target. The very traits that these same quote-unquote debunkers are also railing against, and are now literally attempting to force people into suppressing. Okay, so this was a rant for sure. While I didn't intend to ramble on for this long, I felt the need to vent. Sometimes just letting it out and getting that release is the best therapy you can ever get. It's been a long week. I'm just going to read this from here. A few days ago, I had been talking to someone, going back and forth in regard to, to the question of who could be doing this, the organized stalking, who just came pounding on our door and then ran off. Who's doing all of this? I mentioned a lot of groups, Russia, pro-Russian Ukrainians, the FSB, Mossad, the FBI, the CIA. I don't know. I just don't know. What I do know is that this can't be some random vigilante group. Some small-time group would not have the gear, the resources, the finances, and the power to do this much damage, to literally infiltrate everything. Whoever is doing this has money, power, and influence. Well, that very night, something happened with the kitchen sink. Now, I've mentioned in the past what happened at the other apartment with those massive leaks coming from the floors above us. And that same damn thing happened when we moved here to this apartment. There was a massive leak on a higher floor, and everyone on our tier got soaked to the point where some actually had to leave their apartments. So anyway, the very night I had once again brought up the question of, who's running this sick program. Something happened to our kitchen sink. I turned on the water and it wouldn't turn off. It just kept running and running and running. I had to turn it off at the valve below the sink. It was strange. And there was also some pounding coming from the above floor. It was faint, just loud enough to let us know that they were there, and it continued for hours. And then yesterday, some guy, he was white, about 5'8", skinny, followed me around the store, cutting me off at aisles, flipping his phone up at me as if he was taking my picture, giving gestures, kind of the nose rub gesture, but it's so covert. He might have looked a little strange, but no one else watching would think that it was anything weird, Maybe he was fidgety or something. The nose tap and and more. Finally, I lost him and went back to check out, right? After about a minute, a woman got in line behind me in the checkout line. A little while after that, maybe a minute, I don't know, I didn't count, the same guy got in line behind her. I'm not kidding, there he is again. There were other aisles that had shorter lines, so there was no reason for him to get in line where I was. He stood there making the gestures until I said out loud that maybe some people should get a real job or a real life, or a real job, or fight a real threat for once in their life, instead of earning their money at the expense of other people by getting paid to follow, track, and harass innocent people. This is pathetic. Anyway, after I checked out, I had to stop at the pharmacy, it was in the store. I'd only waited in line at the pharmacy for a few minutes before this same guy came by again. He walked by me while heading to the exit. There was no reason for him to turn where he did. It only took him out of his way. okay? I could see him out of the corner of my eye, and I saw him standing there peering behind one of the shelves, looking at his phone and then occasionally looking back at me. He was also trying to kind of look inconspicuous just so that no one thought he was doing anything weird. He occasionally, glanced at some things on the shelf. He had his white earbuds in too the entire time. So finally, I looked directly at him, and once I did, he gave the gesture, looked at me. He gave the gesture again a second time. It was the nose tap to make sure that I got it, and then he walked off. So he had waited until I actually looked at him, right? He didn't leave until I acknowledged his presence, and he could make his stupid gesture, and I shouldn't have acknowledged him. I should have ignored him the entire time. Even though I had seen him out of the corner of my eye, I shouldn't have looked directly at him because he wanted me to so he could, try to provoke. So that's my bad. I should have ignored him. At this point, they're just trying to provoke me, to show me that they're still there, following me, watching, hunting, tracking, screwing with me, and there's nothing I can do about it. Plus, the very notion of these vile animals in human flesh forcing their way into our lives and waging some form of warfare drives me to absolute rage. The notion that they have this much power and yet, like pathetic cowards, they use it to hunt, stalk, and terrorize lone targets who have no way of fighting back, people who were at least once innocent. I mean, I don't think anyone is going to stay completely innocent after years of this type of attack, but targets started out innocent, and they do this. The perpetrators do this instead of ever going after a real threat. I mean, think of the good they could do for humanity if they used all this power to go after the real bad guys. But they don't do that. They're too cowardly for that. This is a coward's war game where they can attack while feeling that they're not at any real risk because they have their targets outnumbered, outgeared, Anyway. And plus, most of their targets start out so benign and mild they wouldn't even think of fighting back physically. It's not their nature. At some point, it might become their nature. They might be driven to that. Anyway, it's absolutely impossible to have respect for anyone who behaves like this. But, I'm not going to go into that rant right now. And I think maybe I've gone too far right now. This is not the time for it. And I don't want to go back to that dark place right now. So I was in the store waiting by the pharmacy for about 10 minutes after he left. Enough time for him to walk on and be gone. Well, that didn't happen. I walked out of the store, and sure enough, there he was, standing there waiting a few yards down. As I got closer, he crossed the street in front of me. He could have crossed long before that, as there were major gaps in traffic. But he waited until I was close enough to see him and where he was going. He walked right into the building across the street from where he and I had been standing before he crossed. He looked back at me before he walked in, stalled for a few moments, texted something or pretended to, stalled again as he looked back at me again, and then walked into the building. They expected me to follow him in so that he could play the victim and report me. I did not take the bait. Here's the thing. Well, I'm sure some perpetrators think this is nothing more than a harmless game, and others were led to believe that they are on the good side. The perpetrators who intentionally try to set people up on false charges know damn well that they're not working for the good guys. These little animals in human flesh will bait and provoke the target to outburst, just to report the target when he or she finally breaks down. Or they'll follow behind the target, making noises, gestures, or whispering nasty comments, only to cut in front of the target before entering a shop, so that it looks like the target is following them. Or they try to get the target to follow after them, only to report the target as the stalker. I mean, this is literally satanic level deception. This is what happened. It is biblical. Okay, these sick, depraved, psychopathic liars know damn well they're not trying to catch a bad guy. They're trying to entrap, to set up someone on false charges, to make it look like something it isn't. Like, to reverse, this is a satanic reversal. They're trying to reverse what's actually happening. Make the bad guys look good and the good guys look bad. They know what they're doing is wrong, and they do it anyway. They have no love for God. They hate the word. They blaspheme the very existence of the word as their lying lips proclaim faith, but their actions prove the opposite. They are attacking targets in the same manner that King David was attacked by those who hunted him. He spoke in the Psalms of being followed, surveilled, spied on, lied about, infiltrated, poisoned, or someone at least attempted to poison him. I don't think he was actually poisoned. That even his closest friends had been turned against him. The vile beasts who pulled this garbage back then are probably of the same element as modern day perpetrators. So who are they? I mean, they seem to come from all groups. Any guesses? I know a lot of targets have their theories. We all have our theories. It's just there's so much, there's layer upon layer of deception and manipulation and, misdirection. It's so hard to know. Anyway, so I actually typed this up last night, Christmas Eve. Today is Christmas Day. As I was writing this out, I got up to go to the bathroom. As soon as I walked in, they started pounding above the ceiling in the bathroom. They do this. They'll start pounding right above my location in the apartment, right above my location in the apartment. I'll move. The pounding will stop, only to pick up again after I enter another room, like the kitchen or the bathroom. These sick, perverse animals are trying to lead us to believe that they can see us even in the bathroom and hear us. They do this also by having their lackeys, their perpetrators repeat, sometimes word for word, conversations that we had in private. Just thinking about how amoral, psychopathic, and absolutely deranged anyone must be to do this to someone is truly terrifying. Just thinking about it makes me want to crawl out of my skin. And the solution given by society's so-called stable individuals would be, any guesses? Here's a hint. It isn't to do whatever is necessary in order to stop the attack from happening. It isn't to speak up about this crime in hopes of drawing enough attention to it so as to finally shut it down. And it isn't to give advice to other targets. No, instead, it's to shut off and stop caring, to get used to it and live life as if you have a normal life, as if this is normal. To pretend it isn't happening, to stop letting it bother us, and to go on as if nothing out of the ordinary is taking place, and to stop complaining. Obviously, if we're speaking about it, we're not pretending it isn't happening. And again, we do need to remove ourselves from this sometimes. We do need to prevent them from provoking us, to not allow ourselves to be provoked. We do need to shut off sometimes. We do need to get peace somehow. But just pretending nothing is happening and living a normal life, pretending this is normal, normalizing this is not the solution. Okay? Being hunted, tracked with illegal surveillance, even in our homes, watched 24/7, having people repeat things we said in private, thus showing us we are being listened to at all times. They want us to know they're after us. They want to piss us off. Having people repeat things we said and did in the bathroom, having people break in and tamper with our personal belongings, thus showing us that these sick and depraved animals, have full access to us and control over us. And then there's the life-destroying defamation that leads to the community running us out of society, and even to security being called to follow us around stores. Though they never tell us what we did wrong or give us a chance to defend ourselves. How sick is this? And then there are the lackeys who come pounding on the door and run off. Yes, they still do that. They did it in the other apartment and they do it here. Or they'll drive by and throw things out of their car at us, or try to run us down. And the brainwashed, the brainwashed among the population tell us to just ignore all of it, right? That's asking too much of anyone. They ask us to ignore things that they would never be able to ignore. They're hypocrites. You give them just a little bit of what they've done to us, and they would flip out. So they're hypocrites. It's asking too much of anyone. It's impossible. And when we fail at achieving the impossible, they condemn us for that, and they use that against us. In order to further attack our character. Look, to a certain extent, again, as I said, we do have to try to block it out, even for just a little while. We need some peace. We need to calm down. We need this in order to just carry on with life, right? In order to live. And I do try to block it out sometimes, to pretend it isn't happening for a little while, pretend that I can live a normal life and enjoy the same freedoms that my fellow Americans take for granted. But just shutting off indefinitely and pretending that nothing is happening and that this is all perfectly fine is not the solution. Learning to live with this and normalizing it is the worst thing that anyone, target and non-target alike, can do. And don't get me wrong, we do need to learn to live despite what's happening. But we don't want to normalize this to the point where we're accepting it and the population begins to accept it. Learning to adjust to life under 24/7 surveillance where we are being run out of society due to extreme character assassination, can't even walk out the door without one of these depraved animals letting us know that they are there trying to provoke us to outburst, is not a good solution. But you know who thinks it is? The rulers of the world. They want to get us used to this. They want to normalize it. And they have been, little by little for years, getting humanity used to life without privacy, normalizing the absolute invasion into every aspect of our lives, to the point where these sick perverts know everything we say and do, every movement of our bodies, even on the toilet. How pathologically diseased must anyone be to demand this much control and dominance over the lives of others? And how much evil must they be plotting that they are so desperate to silence opposition? We must resist this. We must fight it, and never, never let anyone tell you that there's something wrong with you for hating every bit of this. If we don't stop this now, the next generation may never even know what freedom was like. They'll be so used to having depraved perverts come up with every excuse imaginable to justify watching them every second of their lives, even on the toilet. Tell me, is that the society you want to live in? For those of you who have kids or grandkids, is that the society you want for your children and grandchildren? Or for the future generation? For those of you who don't have kids, you still must care about the future generation, don't you? Our failure to secure a free world now will lead to absolute slavery for the next generation. Even if there are no physical bars, they will be living in an open-air prison where all of their movements and vocalizations are monitored, and even thinking the wrong thing can lead to their destruction. It's a prison for the mind. Anyway, I didn't intend for this to turn into the long rant that it has become. It's just that everything is getting harder and harder. It's been a particularly brutal week. So, to everyone out there who loves the word, targets and non-targets alike, always remember what the word actually is. None of us are perfect. We're all going to screw up, make mistakes, occasionally fall back into old patterns of behavior that we were trying to leave behind. And while none of this is good, it still doesn't remove us from God's presence, although of course we should try to improve. Everybody should. I'm not perfect, and I'm not preaching. I don't preach. I'm not a dogmatist, and I don't hold as holy any law that man makes in the name of God. Only one command is holy, and that command was given by the Word, and the Word is the golden rule. Merry Christmas.